Okay, hello chess players. One of my very first videos on YouTube was a video called An Honest Look at 1H4. And a lot of people asked me to redo that video. It was a very popular video. I did it in front of a display board. And a lot of people asked me to redo that video using the equipment that I have right now. And in a large part, that's what this video is, although I am going to try to expand on that video. I'm going to try to give good preparation both for white, like basically showing all the tricks here, but also good preparation for black and sort of the best way to refute it if somebody does play 1H4 against you and you have to play the black pieces. And I want to try to give that same general overview of the basic strategy of what's going on, the basic structures, and understanding sort of the complexities of a first move like 1H4 and how a move like this works. Anyways, if you like content like this and want to see more of it, please hit that subscribe button and click on your notification icon. So let's get the easy stuff out of the way. 1H4 is a bad first move. Let's just make that really clear. If you put it on an engine, the engine will immediately give slight edge black. Now, that being said, it's only slight edge black, so really 1H4 isn't worse than a lot of really questionable gambits that people like to play. For example, like the Latvian gambit is a major advantage white, and there's a couple other gambits that I've covered on this channel where the computer will give like assessment as like +1 or +2 or even +3 to somebody playing white or black, and people still play gambits like that, I guess playing for tricks, so they're willing to take like a minus, 2 or 3 pawn position, an objectively losing position. H4 is by no means objectively lost. White's a little bit worse, but maybe no more than that. Now, that being said, I think understanding what H4 does and what H4 doesn't do is really important to understanding the center of the board and understanding how to handle the center of the board and how to handle transitions. And just to give an example, white can actually have a major advantage after just a couple of moves here, with black seemingly playing natural moves, or natural moves to some people. For example, we could have H4, and then we could have pawn to E5, and then we could have pawn to C3, and then we could have F5, which is a question mark move. D5 is better, and I'm sure I'll get comments, but I'm going to come back to D5 because we're going to talk about some of the theory of 1H4, because really there is theory. You can work a lot of this stuff out depending on how black handles the center. But after F5, white's already got an advantage after D4. This is already slight edge white. You can put it on a computer if you don't believe me. It's already slight edge white. After D4, and then you have E4, then bishop G5, and then knight F6, E3 is already major advantage white. So when you're looking at 1H4, you have to ask, how can we go from slight disadvantage white on move 1, which is definitely where we're at when we play 1H4. This is slight disadvantage white. This is slight edge black. How can we go from that to major advantage white after a couple seemingly natural moves from black? Well, this comes to like a fundamental misunderstanding about what 1H4 does and a fundamental misunderstanding of the center. And therefore, people tend to misplay against 1H4 because they don't understand what's going on in the middle of the board. So to further explain that, let's just talk about what the center is. These 16 squares is generally described as the center of the board. It's, the area from F3 to C3 to C6 to F6. Okay, simple enough. Why do we define this as the center? It's the place where the knight controls 8 squares. If I take a knight and I put it on F3, it controls 8 squares. If I take a knight and put it on any of these 16 squares, it controls 8 squares. The bishops control more territory in the middle. The queen controls more territory in the middle. It's the place where pieces control more territory. It's also an important strategic location. From the middle, you can get to any other side of the board. To get from the king side to the queen side, you have to go through the middle, etc. So controlling the middle, very, very important. So traditional control of the center is we plant pieces in the middle of the board, and that controls the center. And therefore, when we talk to beginners, we say, when you play 1H4, you're not attacking the center of the board, you're not developing a piece, therefore 1H4 does nothing. Actually, it hurts you. And this is both partially true and not true, because it is true that it hurts you. It's a weakening move. It weakens your king side slightly. It weakens G3 and G4, but it doesn't do nothing. It doesn't do nothing for the center of the board, and that's because not every square in the center of the board, not every one of these 16 squares is created equally. It's true that a knight on F3 controls the same number of squares as a knight on F4. The knight on F3 controls 8 squares, and the knight on F4 controls 8 squares. But there is a big difference between a knight on F3 and a knight on F4. One of the things you have to realize is a knight on F3, yes, it controls 8 squares, but only some of those squares are in the middle of the board. So 2 of those squares might be in the middle of the board, and then other squares are going to be on the edge. Those squares on the edge are not desirable. The squares in the middle are desirable. But a knight in other locations is much better placed. Like if you place a knight in the absolute, what we call the sweet center, one of these 4 squares, a knight in the center of the board is going to control a lot of squares that also control 8 squares. And some of those squares are going to be in your opponent's position. So, generally speaking, people separate the knight's value when it goes to squares into 3 subsets of squares. You have the sweet center, which is the 4 squares in the middle, and then you have your corner squares. The corner squares are the least valuable. The sweet center squares are, of course, the most valuable. And then you have the remaining squares that I haven't highlighted, but we'll draw arrows on them. Those remaining squares are the second most valuable, because a knight on f4 or f5 is more valuable than a knight on f3, because a knight on f4 on f5 will control more squares in the middle. And that's where understanding h4 comes into play. h4 controls the square g5. And if you control the g5 square, you can put a knight on the f4 square. So if you want to plant a knight or plant a piece on some of these more valuable central squares, you need to control the squares next to them. And in order to control the squares next to them, you need to move pawns on the rim. And you can start with 1h4 if you want, and you can start etching out this territory. You can etch out the f4 square and start trying to control that square on the rim, and also etch out the g5 square, etc. And that's why when we have something like h4, e5, and then say c3, f5, and then we have d4, d5, and black completely concedes the f4 square to the knight forever and ever within the first 3 moves, black has already made some huge positional mistakes just within the first 3 moves of the game. So that's something to keep in mind. You can get sort of a major advantage here with white if white misunderstands, if black misunderstands how to handle this first move, or if he just misunderstands what's going on in the center of the board, what h4 is actually doing. It's attacking the extended center, which extends, really all the way from a6 to h6 to h3 to a3, because you need those rim pawns to protect squares that are next to the center, and therefore this becomes the extended center. Now, of course, if the chessboard extended a little bit further, if we had a few more files, then definitely if we go all the way to the edge, then the moves start becoming, more and more useless, because then they're not even etching out territory in the middle, they're etching out territory that's close to the middle, but I digress. So if we go back, we need to start asking, okay, what are some things that we do have to worry about if we're going to play h4? Well, quite a bit, but there's also quite a few traps that you can play for depending on how black decides to play the black pieces. So let's go with the good news first. There's various ways that black can approach this. Well, one way that black can approach this, of course, he can just take both pawns and throw them in the middle. He can play e5 and then say c3. He can play d5, for example. And now you should play d4. And again, if he plays e4, you're already pretty close to equal. This is actually still probably just very slightly better for black, but the computer gives an assessment of equals. So, for example, you should just play something like bishop g5. It's also possible to play bishop f4 is also reasonable. Knight f6, and then the computer gives bishop f6, queen f6, e3 as equality. Black has a little bit more space, and that space compensates for the fact that he's given up a few positional concessions. You've given up you've gotten rid of your bad bishop, and you've etched out territory on the f4 square, both of which are valuable things to do, but black has a little bit more space, and that space should be worth a very little bit more. But the position is approximately level at this point. Black no longer has any advantage. It shouldn't even be considered slight edge black, if that helps. So e4 in this position is just a mistake. So really what black should play is black should either capture on d4, with e captures d4, and this should be slight edge black. After ed4, cd4, we should have a position that's very slight edge black, because basically what we've got is we've got a Queen's Gambit exchange variation, and it's actually a Queen's Gambit exchange variation where white's pawn structure is a little bit better in terms of the queen side. He's going to have a minority attack down the road, and normally this is helpful. But he has managed to create some weaknesses on the king side, especially the g3 and the g4 square, because he's played this pawn to h4. And as you'll see in the future, white would, in a lot of cases, prefer to have this pawn back on h2. Now, that's not saying that there's not move orders that black can play that'll make it very valuable to have this pawn on h4, but it's sort of a rosy picture. Now, what white can do is he can develop with the idea of, say, after bishop g5, knight f6, e3, he can develop with the idea of placing this knight on g2 eventually, like playing bishop d3 followed by knight on g to e2. So black has to be a little careful that he doesn't let this position sit for too long, because if he just, lackadaisically castles and, maybe plays rook e8, knight on b to d7, and we get a chance to play knight bishop d3 and knight on g to e2, of course, white's going to have an advantage because h4 at that point is probably not going to hurt him, because he's going to have sort of a leg up on a kingside attack. So black needs to jump on attacking that bishop right away, and already this is kind of awkward for white. White can't retreat the bishop without the bishop capturing it and messing up white's pawns, so white's kind of left with making this capture, which makes the move h4 look a little weird because it's not a fishing pole move anymore. If you wait till you castle and then play h6, a lot of times white can leave the bishop there as sort of a fishing pole maneuver, and he can just keep it there because then when you play hg, he can respond with hg and he can play for mate against the castled king. But in this case, white would have to exchange, and then bishop d3 here, and then let's just say knight on g to e2. This position is actually going to be slight edge black because the normal strategy in a position like this would be to play something like knight g3 followed by f3 and e4. But you can't do that because you really need your pawn back on h2 if you're going to do that. Because here, in this situation, the bishop can, of course, capture that knight as soon as it lands on g3, and you're just going to kind of have a terrible position with your knight. But this is probably the strategy that you need to go for, and of course, a lot of players will make the mistake of castling kingside here, and once they do that, and once you play bishop d3, you should be good to go. At this point, at the very least, white has fully equalized. If not, just advantage white. It's not a disadvantage to have this pawn out in the position at this point. You can use sort of the fishing pole trap maneuver to your advantage at this point. h6 is no longer going to force that bishop to retreat or be exchanged. So probably white's starting to get an advantage with this bishop d3, knight on g to e2 line. So this is something that black needs to worry about if he's playing these ED4, CD4 lines. So he needs to be aware of this sort of problem. But if you're playing H4 with white, this is something you need to be aware of. If you can get to this, this is good. So white's doing just fine here. Okay, so another option, of course, for black is to just maintain what's going on. He could just play knight to c6. Knight c6 is fine. These positions are also slight edge black. They're very similar to like a Gurgenidze in reverse, where you play, typically in the Gurgenidze, you play, if you reverse this, it would be knight c3, knight f3 with colors reversed. But the idea would be to eventually play knight f6, where bishop g5 isn't a possibility. So you would have this h-pawn move to h6 to prevent bishop g5. And basically what you're trying to do is you're trying to temporarily prevent bishop f4, and you're trying also to temporarily prevent bishop to g5. And if somebody's going to do anything, you want white to be the one to exchange. And then, of course, when the bishop comes to f4 or whatever, this situation is awkward as well, because now when this knight comes to f6 and e4, it's going to be hitting this bishop, which is going to be extra weak, because this pawn would rather be on h3 than h4. So h4 is a little bit of an awkward square for that pawn instead of h3, etc. So that's something that you're looking at. And of course, if they don't take on e5, then eventually they have the awkward situation of, like, if black continues with, say, h6, and not h5, h6, followed by knight to f6, this bishop has nowhere to go. So, like, white has to do something in the middle to sort of try to justify that he's played h4. So knight c6 is another reasonable way that black can play this position, and black can expect to have a slight edge. So e4 is equality. E takes d4 is probably slight edge black, and knight c6 is probably also slight edge black. And, there's ways that black can go wrong down the road with both of those moves, but for the most part, both of those moves should be slight edge black. Now, all that being said, I don't think this is the absolute best way for black to play it. I think the absolute best way for black to play these positions is to continue with d5 is a little bit better, because this makes things a little bit more awkward for white. Of course, white can, just continue with something like d4 and just say, aha, we're playing d4, d5 with h4 thrown in. But, of course, why not just start with d4? I don't know. It seems weird, and it is actually still slight edge black. It's actually just better not to have this move in. It's not like you're playing colors reversed. It's not like you're playing black. it's actually better not to have this H move in. You'd rather have it on H2 with it being black's move. You do have weaknesses on G3 and G4 now. These are slightly weakened squares that weren't weakened a move ago. So it's not a favorable reverse Queen's Gambit or whatever. But you could play D4. But what you should probably try is you should probably try something like C3, again going for E5, D4. And then when they play C5, you can, of course, again continue with pawn to D4, but again, pawn to D4 is just going to be slight edge black. Again, having H4 included is not helpful. So really, you should just continue to play something different. You should play G3. So now things get a little interesting. There's all kinds of possibilities here. The main possibility is going to be something like knight c6, and then after bishop g2, black should just play e5, and these positions should be major advantage black. And I'm not slight edge black, but probably major advantage black are these positions. And I'm going to get back to these positions in a minute. But if you want to try to trap people with the white pieces, there are other ways that people can play this. And yeah, this is a little bit of fantasy chess, but I've had it happen a lot. People can play ideas like bishop f5, and there are kind of cute tactics here. For example, you can play d3, and then after a move like e6, black is already lost to a move like g4. Of course, the point being that, bishop g6, we have h5, and for those of you that were just shouting at your computer screen, yes, they can take the pawn on g4, but in the case of bishop takes g4, queen a4 check does actually win the bishop. So that's actually decisive advantage white, and it's a very cute trap against the bishop. But there are other ways to trap the bishop even in the other line, which are kind of interesting because people will try different move orders in these cases. Like they'll try stuff like knight f6, g3, and then c5, and you can get to this from the c5, knight c6 move order, which is why I'm covering this all under the same umbrella before I go back into knight c6. But you would have something like bishop g2, knight c6, knight d2, and we have the same threat. We have the threat of e4 followed by h5. So if people try to play passively with e6, you have e4 takes, and then say bishop g6, you would have h5, again winning that bishop. And if they play something else, if they play after, say, e4 takes, bishop g4, you're actually still winning, like f3, queen c7, knight e2, bishop d6 you can take, and you can get away with it. And there's this whole line here, bishop g3, knight g3, queen g3, king f1, knight g4, queen f3, of course preventing mate. And then after knight h2, rook h2, queen h2, knight c4, which threatens bishop f4, trapping the queen. The queen would have to retreat, bishop f4 anyway, e5, bishop g3, and rook d8, h5 is decisive advantage white according to the engine. So that's another possibility as well. But generally speaking, whenever black takes these passive strategies of not pushing this pawn 2 or getting this bishop outside the pawn chain early, it again shows a misunderstanding of what's going on in the middle. When white plays h4, he's actually etching out the territory of these squares a little bit more. So it's actually kind of dangerous to put a piece there because white is kind of trying to declare that he actually controls the f5 square. So your loose bishop sitting on f5 is not particularly safe sitting on that square. So it's a lot better to have that bishop sit back at home, and it's also a lot better to go after the whole middle and plant a pawn on e5 at some point because you do want to prevent a piece from coming to f4. So that's why if we go back to this whole line beginning with c3, the best move order is going to be something like c5. And then we're going to have g3, knight c6, bishop g2, e5. And then we're going to have d3. And now at this point, I highlight all these moves, f6, knight f6, f5, bishop e7, because honestly, they're all playable, and they should all be major advantage black. At this point, black has the big center. We're basically playing a King's Indian defense reversed. And in the King's Indian defense reversed in this case, even though we can try to pretend like h4 is a useful move because in the King's Indian in general, black does try to gain space on the king side, it's very difficult to prove that it's a useful move in practice against any of these options. Against knight f6, f6, f5, or bishop e7, it's very difficult to prove it. Now, I would say out of all of them, I'm most afraid of the Samish. I think the Samish is a solid, scary weapon, even in like just the normal moves in the Samish. And then I would say white should continue with something like knight d2, and then we could have bishop e6, we could have a3, queen d7, and now I feel like white should try to pretend like his position's useful. He should try something like h5, and then bishop d6, and then knight f3, sort of with the idea of, trying to, again, etch out that f5 square, play something like e4, knight h4, and maybe plant a knight on f5 later. The biggest problem is it just doesn't work. Like, even in this position, it's sort of a terrible plan. Like, after a5, we should probably actually just switch gears and play c4, and just generally go after the light squares that we've started etching out. Basically going after this light square, etching out that light square diagonal, and we've done a little bit of work going after these light squares here. So probably just c4, just going after the light squares in general, is going to be our best shot at getting something where at least we're not lost. This is, still probably advantage black, but maybe we're just not lost here. So maybe c4 is the way to go, and again, this should still be advantage black, but it's maybe a more interesting attempt, because it seems like if instead of c4 we go something like knight h4, they can just cover everything. Knight on g to e7, e4, d4, and then if we castle, even g5, according to the engine, is already decisive advantage black. It's just everything is covered. You can't really play knight f5. That square is covered 3 times. Of course, at this point, if you play hg6, this is only helping black generate a kingside attack faster, and his kingside, he can actually play on the kingside faster than you can. You can't play f4, etc. You don't have your pieces set up in the right way that you would want to, even just in a normal King's Indian defense, to sort of break out. So that means if you want to play chess like this, if you're playing this passive setup and you get here, you should probably play something like c4. The computer line runs knight on g to e7, maybe h6, g5, cd5, knight d5, something like knight c4, bishop c7, knight fd2, rook d8, knight e4, queen e7, bishop d2, castles, rook c1, king h8, knight e3 is at least very interesting. They can play b6 and batten down the hatches, and this should be major advantage black, but this is a position that you could have easily achieved out of something like this is like a hedgehog formation. And people do play these positions with black against white when white plays like a Maroczy bind. So white's playing like a Maroczy bind against a hedgehog, and this is certainly a playable structure for white. You're basically playing a reverse system. You're playing the black pieces with white, and you're also playing an opening with white that normally I try to avoid with black. I personally don't like these hedgehog formations where white has like the full Maroczy bind, and he's just preventing you from breaking out with d4. But there are players that like to do this. Ulf Anderson used to play positions like this all the time with both colors, and he would get away with it. He understood them very well. So it might be somewhat playable, but at least the engine does give this as major advantage black. So that kind of concludes the video of just sort of how to play 1h4, understanding 1h4, how to play against 1h4, how to keep track of that center of the board, how to make sure you don't get a disadvantage if you have to defend against somebody that's playing 1h4, and of course how easy it is to get a disadvantage when you're playing against 1h4. And when I play 1h4 in blitz games on the internet or whatever, I win quite a few blitz games, even against very strong players, even against titled players who just misplay the center of the board with what they think are seemingly natural moves. And they can end up with a disadvantage or end up in serious trouble very, very quickly by just misunderstanding what that first move does. So anyways, I hope you found this video helpful. I hope you learned something new about chess, and I hope you can use some of these ideas in your own games. Thank you very much for watching.